So what I'm presenting here today is work in progress, which now has not 3 but 4 authors, whom you see listed on this first slide. And our starting point, essentially, is that all 4 of us work in completely different empirical fields. One of us, Laura, is an now works in ethnomusicology. Andrew works in STS and infrastructure studies. I do research on protest and social movements. And Luca is a specialist in urban sociology. And we have noticed, working all of us within the paradigm of regimes of engagement developed by Laurent Thévenot and various collaborators, that in all of these fields, exploration is a central endeavor, a central mode of engagement that we encounter again and again, but it's under-theorized both within the paradigm of regimes of engagement and in sociological theory in general. I'm not aware of any major sociological theory, correct me if I'm wrong, that really places exploration at the center of its theorizing. And yet, in contemporary societies, not just in our particular fields, of course, exploration has become an absolutely central experience, and one that is also central to new valuation models, new modes of governance, in connection with the rise of the internet, with connectionist capitalism, etc., etc. So the theoretical framework that we're starting from is that developed by Laurent Thévenot, essentially, which works with regimes of engagement and grammars of commonality and difference. And the late Nicolas Auré had proposed in several of his publications and in his dissertation that exploration might be a regime of engagement in its own right. And in his studies of hackers and computer games, he went some way towards identifying what it might be and what kind of grammar of commonality and difference might emerge from it, which he called an agonistic grammar. So we want to continue this line of thinking and flesh out an exploration-based grammar in greater detail. And this paper presents in brief form our ideas and some of the challenges that we encounter. So just by way of introduction, if not all of you are familiar with this paradigm, what are regimes of engagement? So it's important to note that regimes of engagement are not discursive constructs. This is not something we just encounter in discourse. They are pragmatic modes of acting in ways that are appropriate to each situation in which we act. And they enable us to calibrate our actions by assessing, the cues provided by our surroundings according to one of several possible conventional formats. They are different ways of practically evaluating the situation. There are different ways of formatting the relevant information that we encounter, and there are different ways of deploying capacities, human capacities in that situation. And each regime then gives rise to its own grammar of commonality and difference, which in other words is a different way of being individuals and relating to others. So from all the different ways in which we can differ from each other, each grammar of commonality and difference will choose one that is considered relevant. So the regimes that have been identified so far in the literature in greatest detail are the regime of planned action, which is when we are strategic, when we choose from options, when we project ourselves into the future, and we have certain intentions that we pursue in the world. Another regime is the regime of justification, which will be familiar to those of you who know the famous book that Laurent Thévenot co-wrote with Luc Boitanski on justification, which is when we respond to critique in situations of reality test, and we have to relate our personal concerns to a larger order of worth that defines, in a sense, what values are applicable to the situation, based on the idea that there has to be some sort of benefit for the community or for humanity as a whole. And then there's the very important regime of familiarity, which in a sense is the opposite of the regime of planned action. And it's a regime when we feel at ease with our surroundings and we don't need to project ourselves into the future to strategize, to plan, etc., etc. So what we propose, first of all, is that there is a fourth regime, which is the exploratory regime, and which is defined by the fact that it values the novel and the unfamiliar. So in a sense, it's the opposite of the regime of familiarity. It formats information by the degree to which it is surprising rather than familiar. And the capacity that it actualizes in a situation is the capacity to be curious, to be playful, and to kind of be in a flow and explore novel aspects and novel features of the situation. Now, what then would be the relationship between this regime of exploration and the other regimes that I very briefly identified? So looking at exploration and familiarity, in a sense, as I mentioned, they are direct opposites. So exploration very often is about escaping oppressive familiarity, escaping the routines and the norms that we are accustomed to, but which we experience as oppressive. But then exploration also requires a measure of familiarity in order to function, because we always need some measure of redundancy in order to be able to identify the new. Otherwise, there's just noise and chaos. Looking at the relationship between exploration and planned action, both in a sense could be defined as purposeful activities, but the projection of the self into the future is impossible in exploration, because we cannot exactly predict the future, because it's always to a degree random and novel and yet to be discovered. And also exploration is often experienced as an irresistible corporeal urge, and Nicolas Auré had some wonderful examples of that from his work on hackers, who just keep hacking for 48 hours without sleep, drink, or food. That leaves no room for autonomy and the kind of mastery over self that we associate with the regime of planned action. And yet exploration empirically often collapses very easily into planned action once a space has been explored and we kind of go back to strategizing about how we can behave in that space. And then finally, exploration and justification, there's a strong contrast there, because justification relies heavily on upholding and stabilizing conventions in the form of different orders of worth, whereas exploration typically happens at the margins of stabilized conventions and kind of twists them and adds something novel to them, sees them in a new light. So the empirical examples that we come from in our respective fields, in ethnomusicology, think of musical improvisation on traditional themes. And musical improvisation will also integrate random outside impulses. So you're in a jam session, you hear a bird singing, and you integrate the melody of that bird song into your jam session, and that then gets recognized by the other participants. And you find this in a wide variety of traditional musical genres. In STS and infrastructure, Andrew has been working on ways of programming to facilitate kind of serendipitous discovery and different kind of folksonomic ways of tagging, but then also interoperability between completely different computational ontologies. So how do you enable people using different computational environments to discover interesting elements and then talk to each other? In my own work on protest and social movements, I observed in protest in Russia a strong set of examples of playful interaction around witty and original slogans, where participation in protest was not about a strategy, an agenda, a set of ideas that you want others to share, but a kind of a playful interaction about who's the most original in their slogans. But then also people treating protest events as the only settings in an authoritarian society in which they can actually explore the diversity of society and of political positions. And then finally, Luca's work on urban sociology, he's been looking at how art-based and militant deflection works in tourist settings when you try to deflect from established tourist routes and kind of build up a new type of visitors community, enabling people to explore your city in a new way. So that would be kind of very briefly the contours of the regime of exploration. And then, so this is something that we would encounter in a sense as persons. But what kind of plural grammar might we then be able to observe that builds on this grammar, on this regime of exploration? What kind of grammar of commonality and difference emerges from the regime of exploration? So the important thing about grammars is to state that they are not just mechanical extensions. It's not, here you have a grammar, and then once we get to a collective level, the regime becomes a grammar. But there are a certain set of requirements within the sociology of regimes of engagement that a grammar has to fulfill to really function as a way to construct political community. It needs to provide a specific way of differing. So, how do we differ when we choose from a menu of, let's say, political options versus when we debate the common good? It needs to provide a mode of communication, so of making things common, of bridging or integrating differences. It requires intermediary objects. It needs to provide a way of articulating differences and also potentially of introducing a hierarchy of difference. So, for example, in the orders of worth, there would be a hierarchy of status. In the domestic order of worth, your status is higher than mine because you are maybe closer to a source of traditional authority. And then it also very often corresponds to a specific type of emotional regime. And I know this is very compressed, but maybe in the discussion, if you have questions, I can answer them. So this is a very large and possibly confusing table, but this basically summarizes the whole construction of grammars of commonality and difference, and kind of defines the grammars arising from the regimes of justification, individual plan, and familiarity. And to this, in our work, we're trying to add the contours of a grammar of, we still don't know what to call it exactly, of exploration, common exploration, improvisation, serendipity, or creative expression, which as intermediary objects would have uncommon places, so places that are not yet familiar, which are being explored, which would provide for communication between actors through playful interaction based on the skills that they're displaying in exploration. It settles differences between these actors by recognizing that the whole diversity of skills that is implicated in them and bringing them together in a kind of resonance. And it assumes that everybody is engaged in a regime of exploration. So this is our current mind map of essentially the terms or the observations that would need to go into a fully fledged description of what exploration is about. And in our discussion, we've sort of gotten to the point right now where we think that a very important element of exploration is the display of skills in various settings that enable such displays. So as I mentioned, joint musical improvisation would be a classical example, but also protest events in which you can sort of explore what is the effervescence that's going on in society around you, and many others. And so participants get, in a sense, judged by the skill that they display, which in an ideal case becomes not just skill but virtuosity, and they are differentiated from each other by the singularity that comes with displaying diverse skills or diverse forms of virtuosity. Obviously, exploration also relies on or kind of resonates with creative expression, with serendipity. There is a competitive contesting element in that exploration of, or common plural joint exploration often happens in a sort of agonistic framework where we playfully exhibit the kind of the prowess of our different skills and judge each other by how great our mastery of our skills are. But all of this always needs to happen within a framework of playfulness and resonance in which our various skills somehow contribute to the whole and are kind of choreographically experienced as contributing to a joint resonance. And just like the other grammars, exploration clearly relies on a number of dispositifs, of kind of architectures that conventionally format the different situations that we encounter and in which we engage as explorers, so that we kind of pragmatically recognize them as situations that call for explorations, or situations in which a regime of exploration is appropriate. And clearly a very important element of any such dispositif, be it musical or protest or STS or urban, is a randomizer, something that introduces an element of the unexpected, thus kind of frustrating or thwarting any attempt to plan ahead or to act according to a kind of a familiar ease or a way to engage with conventional modes of justification. There is, as I mentioned, some sort of agonistic framework that needs to already be in place. So, for example, jazz musicians sitting on a stage will kind of almost automatically pass into that agonistic framework where everybody tries as best they can to display their musical skill. But the agonistic framework needs to be bounded by a need for resonance, because all of that exploration then needs to come together in a greater whole that is more than just the parts. And there need to be kind of micro rites of passage that call all our securities, all our conventional reference points into questions, be they the options that we already have on our menu of options, be they our familiar attachments, or be they the kind of the socially accepted orders of worth, right? Exploration kind of makes all of that fluid and approaches all of it in a new playful mode. But then it is clear that the grammar of exploration appears to be a very transient one, a particularly transient one, perhaps more transient also in its dispositif or in its architecture than the architectures for individual interests or orders of worth. Because if you think of, for example, a menu of options that we have, for example, as voters in a democracy, they're very stable, they're very kind of predictable, it's very clear how they are defined and what they are, whereas the architectures of exploration very quickly collapse because the space kind of gets saturated, and once we've finished exploring, once we have a sense that we've now explored enough, we very quickly kind of go back to a strategic, a planned regime, or we are exposed to a need to justify our actions according to an existing order of worth. So the grammar of exploration with the kind of attendant dispositif seems to be inherently unstable. So there are obviously tensions between the different grammars, and one of the reasons why it's important to look at them jointly together is that the grammars tend to be inhospitable to each other, and they negate each other's ways of recognizing difference, such that given the current predominance of the regime of individual choice and the grammar of individual interest, we tend to simply ignore all the other existing grammars, for example, the ones based on familiarity and order of worth, but also the one based on exploration. So there's a tension with the grammar of commonplaces, clearly, because treating the commonplace that one person inhabits as another person's object of exploration is experienced by the first person as an intrusion, and then vice versa, excessive familiarity or attachment is experienced as an impediment to exploration or a lack of openness. There's a tension with the grammar of individual interests, because the very injunction to articulate interests and to have a plan for the future is experienced as limiting, because it reduces the multitude of creative expression. And then conversely, the excitement of exploration is experienced in the grammar of individual interest as a lack of autonomy, a lack of responsibility and purpose, as an addictive or an excessively ludic behavior. And I'll skip ahead. There's a tension with the grammar of orders of worth, because the need to engage in justification is experienced as excessively formalistic when we are exploring. The orders of worth negate singularity, except for the order of worth that has been described as inspired. And conversely, exploration is experienced as negating and diminishing the stability of well-established common goods or political principles. And this is, I'm concluding here, this is important, we believe, for normative theorizing about politics, because I think it's extremely important to take constructions of political communities seriously, regardless of which grammar of commonality and difference they come from, without kind of allowing one of them to dominate over the others. And more specifically, we believe that this explains the kind of the effervescence of counterculture, but also its fragility, because the singularity that is best kind of described through the grammar of exploration is a response to a false kind of autonomy. If you think that your individual interests are really not so individual because they are kind of framed and defined by the structures of capitalism, then you rebel against that by trying to explore your personal creativity and singularity. But this then often is followed by a reabsorption of your creative expression into a grammar of individual interests with its menu of options. Finally, why this might be interesting for the purposes of this panel, I think so. First of all, this is a contribution to pragmatic sociology because it allows us to reconsider parts of the theoretical framework of this approach. So perhaps what the book on justification identified as a cité of inspiration, and what Boltanski's and Chiapello's book on the new spirit of capitalism defined as a cité by projects, is actually better described, at least to some degree, as a regime of exploration and a grammar of serendipity or resonance or creative exploration. But then going beyond pragmatism, I think there are obvious links or kind of connecting points with other theories. So for critical realism, I would propose that the grammar of serendipity is a very productive generative mechanism, and the move from the regime of exploration to a grammar of serendipity would be a very interesting example of emergence in Bhaskar's definition. With critical theory, as I mentioned very briefly, it allows us to identify gaps in contemporary constructions of community, and it might allow us to think through the kinds of plural grammars that are actually already based on this grammar of creative exploration, but for which so far we haven't yet been able to develop a language. And then finally, it also allows us to specify a certain number of theories that have been very popular both in the social sciences and in the humanities. And the two examples I'm thinking of are Hartmut Rosa's theory of resonance, which I think is very exciting, but not sufficiently specified, but also Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht's book about the production of meaning as one of the main objectives of the humanities today. So thank you for your time and your patience. I will stop here and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Well, my question is, I found that the idea, Misha, of having an exploratory regime, I found it very interesting. And I thought, well, but there are societies where exploration is not that welcome. And therefore, I think there also must be a way of justifying exploration, not only doing exploration, but also justifying exploration. And then again, there would be the question, is that a different regime of justification, or is that more related to inspirational, the inspirational world, as I would have assumed? Yeah.
So I think it's really important to distinguish very clearly between regimes of engagement, first of all, then grammars of commonality and difference that build on these regimes, but which provide a way to engage with each other in a collective way. And then the orders of worth within the grammar of justification, which are really three different things. So I don't think we can say that there is any society that's entirely hostile to the regime of exploration, because I do believe that the regime of exploration arises out of, universal impulses that we possess not even just as humans, but as organisms, right? And Nicolas Auré actually had some really interesting observations drawing on cybernetics and its theorizing about kind of systems and organisms and nature, and how they need to be open to the environment simply in order to survive. And I think, a regime of engagement is of course, not just something that's there naturally. It is, in a sense, a result of socialization processes. But I think it's something that will be familiar to everyone from their own experience, even though it can be shaped differently in different contexts. But I think your question does make a lot of sense if we look at the grammars that build on exploration, you know, a grammar of commonality and difference, which is, you know, what we call a grammar of serendipity or creative expression or something like that. And of course, that grammar is probably kind of can be more or less articulated in different social settings, even though I'm not sure that the difference necessarily will be one between kind of national societies. I think we have to look at more kind of meso-level differences. But then, you know, the question becomes, is there something recognizable in our own culture, in our own social setting, that allows us to interact with each other based on this grammar of exploration? Or are we kind of forced, in a sense, to always go back to, for example, a grammar of individual interests? So do we have to always express ourselves through, you know, being able to choose from a menu of options? But then the third thing that you mentioned is the order of worth in which we can justify that. And I think that's, you know, yet another thing. And of course, we need to understand that as soon as we start justifying our behavior, we're no longer in the mode of exploration, we're in the mode of justification. So we're already in a different regime. But I do think, or I can say we think, because this is something we've discussed quite extensively in our little group, that there are some orders of worth that are more hospitable to some of the regimes than others, right? So we would say that the domestic order of worth, for example, is probably most closely linked to the regime of familiarity. And in the same way, one could probably argue that the inspired order of worth is most closely linked to the regime of exploration. So then, I mean, to answer your question, if you had a social or cultural setting in which the inspired order of worth was particularly kind of fleshed out, that would be an indication that there is some openness to a political grammar, a grammar of commonality and difference that is based on joint exploration.
Very good. If someone else wants to raise a question, maybe put your name in the chat or just switch on your camera and start talking.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah, I made a comment in the chat, and I really enjoyed this panel enormously. Thanks. I really it was one of the best ones all day. Thanks. I just it occurs to me that it's this idea of exploration is somehow related to a book by Christopher Winship about and someone else whose name I know Christopher Winship, but I don't know the other author, so I don't remember his name. But it's about counterfactuals and the importance, so that there is an importance. One of the importances of the idea of exploration is establishing intervening variables and sources of confounding which differentiate between different correlations, indicating that one correlation might be symptomatic of causality or associated with causality, and another one a mere glitch that is of no significance. And unless you can establish some kind of causality, it's difficult to get to something. It's difficult to differentiate between action and mere reaction, if you see what I mean. All action, all movements are not action. Action tends to be intentional and with some expectation of possible success. And in order to have that, you have to have some kind of notion that what you're doing, especially if you're doing a political movement or making a political statement, there's some kind of expectation that what you're suggesting will be attacking a real problem in an effective way. And unless you can establish some kind of notion of causality, that's really almost impossible. And in which case you end up with a society dominated and controlled by conditioners. That is, I don't mean hair conditioners. I mean psychological conditioners who set up buzzwords on the television and in the movies that evoke responses. Like, for example, Trump's appeal is largely, I would suspect, the result of very effective conditioning. Anyway, thanks again for letting me talk a little bit. And I really enjoyed all three of the presentations. Thanks again.
Okay. Do you want to respond to that, Misha, or shall we take the next question?
Do we have time? I mean, I could say a few sentences.
Just try to keep it short,
Okay.
or otherwise get that the next question is that if someone else on the panel wants to speak. I mean, sure, of course, we are here in this cooperative mood. So otherwise, perhaps there is also Jean-Pedro who has another question for you. Perhaps we can take them together, and then that's a way of controlling time. So Jean-Pedro, please.
Okay, thank you. So Misha, I was wondering if you and your team, if it came up for you, the concept of adventure by Simmel, and then it was elaborated by Lyman and Scott in a book called The Sociology of the Absurd. Because the grammar of exploration or serendipity really sounded like the grammar that they use for adventure, in that they characterize it as disruption of time and space, whereas usually in interactions there's a routine, and then adventure is when someone breaks that routine, and then both people or whoever is in the interaction starts exploring new ways of interacting, and then it's a way of creating and testing new ways of thinking and behaving for the subjects. And so I was just wondering if this concept of adventure came up at all, because it really reminded me.
Yes, just very briefly. Adventure certainly is part of our mind map of terms, and so is Simmel. But can you repeat the title of the second book that you mentioned?
A Sociology of the Absurd by Lyman and Scott. I forgot their first names.
Yeah, I'm not actually aware of that. So thanks a lot. That sounds really relevant.
It's great. It's a great book. It's like ethical methodology and other stuff. Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful. I'll just take that as a suggestion, throw it back into our pool.
All right.
If I could just very briefly respond to David's point. I mean, to the extent that I've understood it, I think it's important, but I would disagree because I think one of the main contributions of pragmatic sociology is that action is not limited to a situation where you can plan and where you can project yourself into the future. As you said, they don't need to be intentional with kind of options of success. And specifically, working on protests and political movements, what I want to establish is that there are other really, really experientially important dimensions of protests and social movements that aren't limited to this intentionality. And, if people are present in a protest space and they can't really articulate an agenda, that doesn't mean that it's useless or that they're being manipulated. And I think the regime of exploration is one of the ways in which people can act and interact without necessarily being agents choosing from a menu of options. So I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind this more complex typology of ways in which you can act, which I think can all contribute in rich ways to social movements beyond the kind of linear question of success or failure. Yeah, sure, that's right. I agree with that, but it's also true that there is such a thing as more effective action. Some actions are more effective than other actions, and that was the point I was trying to make. But I agree with what you said. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? We still have a couple of minutes. Okay, I have one. It's for Misha as well. I mean, when you think within the framework of French pragmatic sociology, and especially when you link it to the new spirit of capitalism, and you made this connection, And in your work as well, or in your research, when you say you're looking on social movements, but actually I think that if you raise it, in fact, to the level of the macro level, I think it would be very interesting to think about populist regimes like the one we have in Brazil here, where continuously we are seeing that they are kind of pushing the boundaries. And what you see is that the chaos is in fact a method. And I think that it would be very, very interesting to think that to project kind of this whole regime on the macro level. But I'm just wondering to what extent your pragmatism and your strong pragmatism somehow impedes you to do that. So I would kind of invite you to do what Axel Honneth did with De la Justification when he was raising the issue and looking, in fact, to to macro levels where you have one regime which is basically dominating the other. And I think that would be an interesting take. What you make of that?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm actually part of an international team that looks at protests and social movements in the BRICS countries, so including Brazil, obviously. And I mean, my own take on this would be that even when certain kinds of grammars become dominant in a certain setting, then especially through international comparison, we can still identify elements of the other grammars that are present in that social context. And that, I think, can actually be both kind of cognitively and politically very liberating. So to give you an example, I mean, most of my work is on Russia. And in Russia, you could say that a regime of familiarity and a grammar of common places is extremely dominant, right? A lot of political communication happens through references to things that are considered kind of universally shared, which don't need any sort of explicit reference to orders of worth, et cetera, et cetera. But then, you know, comparing that to what we know from other contexts, I can identify that there are now also extremely strong elements of neoliberalism, which of course relies on a grammar of individual interest, which are in really interesting ways woven into legitimation strategies on the part of Russian elites. And I think, you know, conversely, you can do similar exercises looking at countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, China, the United States, etc., where I think in the North American context, for example, it would have to be the opposite. You would have to identify sources of resistance to the absolute dominance of the kind of regime of interest, of plan, and the grammar of individual interests, to show that a lot of political community building, even in a country as prima facie individualistic as the United States, does rely on things like, you know, shared commonplaces, etc. So I do think that this can be kind of extended, or as Laurent would say, aggrandized to a macro level. But we will rarely find situations where an entire society just completely dominated. Just one last point on this. I mean, I do think it's very important to stress that regimes such as the regime of exploration are very fragile. And indeed, as you rightly point out, explorers are very easy to manipulate, because settings, I mean, there's a reason why Nicolas Auré kind of fleshed out his theory of exploration, looking, for example, at computer games that were designed, you know, purposefully by a small group of people in ways that would encourage people to act like explorers, but which were then also subverted by a small set of really experienced gamers to kind of bring back the strategic regime and to maximize their benefit. And I think this is something that also happens at the macro level in a lot of political contexts.